Welcome again to all of you to this opening plenary panel on the annihilation of democracy, psychology, institutionalized despondency, impunity, and the rise of authoritarianism. I think you'll see from the program that we have a great lineup of South African and international speakers, and I'll introduce them all to you in a minute or so. Shanaz was making the point earlier on that psychology has often had to engage in some way or another. And we've certainly tried to think about this over the last several years, about how psychology engages with some of the big questions, the vexing questions of our time that face society. We thought that for this particular Congress, that one of those big questions facing us today is the very essence of democracy, its practice, its failings, and its possibilities. Now more than ever, we are perhaps witnessing some of the greatest threats to democracy. Forms of authoritarianism, a resurgence in right-wing conservatism, forms of sovereign impunity, militarization, and a social malaise that many of us in South Africa are familiar with when you think about the energy crisis and the water crisis that we face every now and again. It's characterized our society as one that is despondent and with a foreshortened sense of future possibilities. What this panel hopes to engage with from their respective intellectual areas of interest and their contextual locations is really how we understand this historical period within psychology, the social sciences, and the humanities more broadly. Some of the questions that they're going to engage with is what drives this kind of social crisis that we see? What are the opportunities for us to shape a future in which democracy can be rethought and practiced differently? Is democracy invariably a failed project? Is it something that we simply have placed too much emphasis on? Do current market economies, for example, require democracy, or do they actually require just unfettered regulation in the world that we live in? And what and how can psychology, the social sciences, and humanities offer us by way of thinking through this problematic? And can and should democracy as we have come to know it be protected or reimagined at all? How do forms of digital transformation relate to these questions? These are some of the ways in which we've tried to frame this particular panel. And I think that our panelists will all be offering provocations to all of us interested in rethinking our futures as entangled global citizens. So without further ado, I'm actually going to introduce all of the panelists right now so that there's a seamlessness between their presentations because we have quite a tight schedule. I'm going to ask them all to speak for about 12 minutes. Darren Hodgetts and Nick Nelson, who are at Massey, will probably speak for about 15. But let me introduce you to all of them right now. Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, you're seeing her on the screen at the moment, is a Palestinian feminist. She's the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law, Institute of Criminology, and the School of Social Work and Public Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Global Chair in Law at Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on liberation, psychosocial interventions, critical trauma studies, state crimes and criminology, securitized surveillance, gender violence, law and society, and genocide studies. Nadira, a great pleasure to have you with us. And I know that it's after midnight in California at the moment, so we really, really appreciate you staying up, and apologies that we've started somewhat late. I will hand over to you in a little while after I've introduced the rest of the panel. The second person is Dr. Nick Malherbe. Nick is on my right here on stage with me. He's a researcher at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa, and the South African Medical Research Council, Masculinity and Health Research Unit. His research interests include violence, community building, and visual methods. Then we have Darren Hodgetts. Darren, welcome to you as well. I know Darren is also several hours ahead of us at Massey. And so thank you very much, Darren, for joining us in the evening of of the day for you. Darren is a societally and community-oriented social psychologist with interest in addressing issues of human security and insecurity through the provision of indecent work and reductions in urban poverty, homelessness, and food security or insecurity. Darren co-facilitates the Ending Poverty and Inequality Research Cluster at Massey University. Welcome, Darren. Alongside Darren, who will be speaking alongside Darren, Nick Nelson will also be joining us from Massey University. Nick has extensive experience in both security studies and academia, and is currently a senior lecturer at Massey University. He teaches in a diverse range of subject areas, including violence, human factors in cybersecurity, and the psychology of security. His main research interest is in how the online environment impacts on issues of national security. And then finally, we have Hlonipha Mokoena, my colleague from WITS. She's a professor and a South African historian at the WITS Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand, also known as WISER. Hlonipha joined us, but prior to that was actually in the anthropology department at Columbia University, but of course studied here in South Africa and obtained a PhD in 2005 at the University of Cape Town. Hlonipha is a multi-talented public intellectual, well known for her work in many, many different parts of the world, and very strongly placed to both write and speak about the complex entanglements, as well as the striking differences between South Africa and other parts of the world. Now, I'm not going to give you a taster of everything that they're going to say. They've given me a brief abstract. Suffice to say that I think it's going to be a diverse set of presentations and inputs from all of them, and we'll pick up some Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to start by just again saying thank you to all of you. Hlonipha, you look like you're actually sitting in Columbia Library, the New York Library there. I'm assuming that you are in South Africa, but great to have you here. Nick Nelson, thank you for being here, Nick. This is the first time that we're meeting online. And Darren, again, thank you to you. Nadira, thank you to you as well for joining us. At this point, I'm going to ask Nadira to perhaps offer her thoughts on the annihilation of democracy, psychology, institutionalized despondency, impunity, and the rise of authoritarianism. Nadira, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Garth, for all this. And I must say that when reading the invitation and the title of this panel, I was wondering whether there is or was a democracy to start with in the settler colonial context. But then the 26th Congress, entitled Tending to the Seeds of Crisis, Looking for New Horizon to African-Centered Psychology, made me really search for a new horizon. And I found it. It's here in this gathering, in knowing that many of my comrades and friends are there, in sharing, in your solidarity, in the fact that I got the invitation and the insistence to keep on searching and having Palestine on your agenda. So thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start by saying that I want to engage with the invitation from Palestine and from my encounter in the place that knows no democracy, at least in my perception, although it's always framed as the only democracy in the Middle East. How can we disrupt the coloniality of power emanating from creating a facade of democratic settler colonial state when human bodies, communities, life, and death are political economic capitals in the hands of the state that are mobilized by effective racialized regime? As Smith explained in her Color Violence, genocide is the law of the country. The United States, when she talks about the US, could not exist without it. In the US, democracy is actually the alibi for genocide. It is the practice that covers up US colonial control over indigenous land. And I wonder whether this is the situation in Israel-Palestine. So how can we talk about democratic and democracy's psychic ruins assembled via global and local ideologies that conceal invasions, occupations, and unending dispossession? In my attempt to engage with knowledge from within, I want to invite you to think via Fanonian analysis when arguing that psychic ruins are common usage of colonial violence. I'm taking you with me to the epistemic violence established with the founding violence of the state, the uprooting, the massacres, and so on. I'm taking you to the prison and to the grave, to the graveyard, there behind the bars of untruthful framing and naming, where children like Ahmed Manasra, a child that was arrested at the age of 13 and now is 20 years old and is still in solitary confinement, experience slow death. I'm taking you to the cemeteries of Number, where Israel holds the remains of hundreds of Palestinian corpses in secret burial sites in closed military zones, and where Israel withholds slain Palestinian bodies, storing them in refrigerators on a mode I call necropenology. So I examine the political work and symbolic role of the production, performance, and management of death in democratic Israel. In looking closely at the state's violence when ruining the psychic, as in the case of Ahmed Manasra, and the withholding of Palestinian dead bodies as critical sites of inquiry, I argue that the colonizers maintain a necropenological regime of dispossession that marks the colonized as non-human, even when dead. So necropenology is a form of forced confinement of the living and dead colonized entities in frozen and freezing temporality and spatiality. Necropenology is a form of carcerality masked by structurally instituted racialized regime authorized by a colonial legal system and manifested through marking and conquering the flesh, the body, the land, and the psychic. Yeah. And here I bring Achille Mbembe's, who's at WITS, description of necropolitics as colonial sovereignty and control in the simple and brutal right to kill, which parallels the legal negation of indigenous land ownership. And he explained, I quote, the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides in the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who may die. In other words, and I'm quoting again, to exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power, end of quote. So the colonial state's governance of death, including the slow death, yes, goes beyond Mbembe's necropolitics to show how the necropenological regime operates over the flesh of the dead to further evict the native from sanity and from life. A necropolitical regime of dispossession aims to strip dead bodies of their dignity, in death, incarcerate communities and penalize them psychologically, socially, and spatially. So the sudden disappearance of a dead body serves the state to maintain the superiority of the colonial body politics and power. It's there to disorient and reorient the colonized by producing a torturous dialogue between those grieving the loss of their children and those building their supremacy, security, and control to affirm their state and to punish in death and then call the only democracy. So historically and contemporary scholarship on racism, colonialism, and settler colonialism can really explain to us the ongoing colonial violence and carceral politics and how dead bodies in the context of such ongoing violence are not only sites of knowledge production, but also sites of racial power. So I'm taking you with me to Palestine. It's free people, when facing the asphyxiating coloniality of the settler state, framed as the only democracy, where sacralized politics, where surveillance, right-wing extremism, sovereignty, impunity, militarization, and structural racism leaves Palestinians struggling a global, regional, and internal machinery of unfuturity. So is there a democracy for Palestinians facing over 70 years of Zionist necropolitical regime of control? Is it an annihilated democracy by its nature? What I see in this settler colonial democracy is state necromania. So to discuss settler colonial necromania, my talk will look closely at what Joseph Pugliese defined as geocorpography, or, and I quote, the violent enmeshment of the flesh and blood of the body within the geopolitics of race, war, and empire. But I will look at it from three angles fast, one related to the sacralized dismemberment and uprooting, the second related to state governance of hope, and the third related to corpse messaging. Let me start with the dismemberment. Dismemberment and the psychosocial, spatial, and bodily dismemberment is really biopolitical, geopolitical, and necropolitical, yeah? It refers to the multiple psychosocial and spatial violent actions of the state that are meant to debilitate, to mutilate and injure the bodies of otherized in order to control them. So let me give you the example. The Minister of Religious Services in Israel, and his like center-left government, told Israeli high school students in June 2022 that if there was such a bottom that could be pressed and all the Arabs, all Palestinians would be taken out of there, sent in an express train, I would press the bottom. And he continued, because we were expelled from our country 2,000 years ago, for 2,000 years we dreamt, we prayed, we wrote songs, we returned to our country. We believe that God gave us the country, promised it to us. In convent, the Bible is our Kushan. No one will tell us that it's not ours, all of it, but the Arabs have a different story. So such assertion of state minister in the 21st century that invoke biblical narration, and here we have two issues. Number one is the biblical narrations. Number two is the genocidal. If he will pressure bottom and all of us will disappear, it mobilizes state racial structures and create a carceral space of unlivability and erasure to the racial others. So how can a colonial state continue to openly and for over 70 years promote what I call in my book a security theology, where the two theologies are hard at work? One is the security one, and the second is the biblical one. Just look who is selling weapons to South Africa, yeah? The second issue is corpse messaging. Throughout my reflections on Israel's necromania, the corpse of the colonized represents more than the visible and obvious dead body or state of death. In occupied Palestine, the corpse of the Palestinian dead is a site from which the terror of the colonial violence can be analyzed and can be exposed. The corpse is not an exit or a final resting place. It's an entry point to open the discussion into security fetishism, as Nucleus would say, as the deadly complicity between security and capital, a complicity in which the state and capital collide and collude in a mutual bid to reinforce a political agenda structured ideologically around the security fetish, and think about it in a settler colonial regime. The last point is state governance of hope. My analysis of corpse messaging and the annihilation of the living and the dead points to the routine witnessing of violence and uprooting that indigenous people bear in the settler colony. It offers an alternative reading embedded in critical, radical, and localized exploration where racism and the exclusivity of security fetishism of the hegemony are under scrutiny. But the lives, spaces, and bodies of the colonized people have long played a central role in colonial and settler colonial projects. While Patrick Wolf argues that territoriality is settler colonialism's specific irreducible element, the colonization of life, of livability and spaces frequently takes on an embodied form, becoming mapped onto the bodies of the colonized. In colonial justificatory frameworks, racialized hierarchies between fully human colonialist and the subhuman indigenous population often find their base in human flesh, as Wiley would tell us. So marking the bodies and spaces of the colonized as disposable, yeah, and using religio-nationalist rationalization to turn civilian population, its infrastructure, and the spaces it inhabits into targets and threats in life, in death, governs people's hope. In the maze of dispossession generated by political oppression and state political violence, subjugated community have the capacity to tap into their own power, to generate its own internal power, to resist the state's attempt to govern hope, innovating their proficiency to heal themselves and to believe in their just cause and the right to a dignified life, and interrupt state governance of hope through insisting on their livability, dignity, love, and right to a future. As critical scholars such as radical liberation psychologist Ignacio Martin Baró proposed, when approaching marginalized communities that are polarized and ruptured by armed conflict, we must understand trauma as psychosocial and work towards interrupting the machinery of state violence. Yeah. So how can we, as mental health professionals, act towards livability when children in Gaza walk in the March of Return, and Palestinian individuals as Ahmed Manasra, his family, and as the Manasra family and community are actively interrupting state punitive prohibitions and the governance of hope? How can we as mental health professionals engage with local and global manifestations of affective, communal, and intellectual solidarities to constitute collective social hope or co-hoping amid state necromania? This is a question that I would like to leave with you, but I would like to stress the importance of co-hoping amidst this state settler colonial necromania. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Narira. Again, you know, your insights around the question of death and necromania and the impact on space, land, flesh, the body, and the psyche in places like Palestine, I think does beg the question about whether democracy has existed there in the first place. I'm not going to reflect any further on this. I'm going to ask our next speaker to come up. Nick Malherbe will be talking, I suspect, on what he refers to as a cautious defense of democracy. So Nick, over to you.
Hello. This way. Is that all right? Thanks. Should I come down? That's all right. Yeah. Thanks, Garth. Thanks, Garth and Shanaz and Fatima for kindly inviting me to speak here today. Like Garth said, I'm going to offer a kind of cautious defense of democracy, a kind of democracy that sort of embraces its own repeated annihilation. But before we get to that, I say I'm going to exercise a bit of caution in making this defense for a number of reasons. For one thing, slavery, as well as colonial and imperial regimes, formed part of a European project of democratic democracy. And as we know, this project is today far from over. This speaks to what Nadira was saying. Time and time again today, we see US imperial warfare, as well as US support for settler colonies like Israel being carried out in the name of democracy. So-called liberal democracy doesn't really fare much better here, typically serving as a kind of thinly veiled cover for capitalist exploitation, the democratic freedom to choose what we consume, or at which site surplus value is extracted from us, or which economic elite will rule over us for the next couple of years. Margaret Thatcher, who was a central architect of capitalism as we know it today, said that when people are free to choose, they choose freedom. And I think she undoubtedly had this sort of constrained view of democracy in mind here. And so at this point, I don't think it takes an enormous leap of faith to see how democracy, when we take it to mean a capitalistic and thoroughly colonial enterprise, has set the conditions for fascism. There's been a number of thinkers that have sort of made this link between this kind of constrained view of democracy and fascism. Psychologists have been a bit late to the party here, and by and large have ignored it, but we are at CISA. So we can look what Eric Fromm has to say. And he spoke about that when all that democracy means is that when all that democracy does is make the individual responsible for systemic violence, democracy becomes burdensome and terrifying. People, he says, will want to escape from this kind of democratic freedom. And then what happens is that fascism kind of steps in and offers itself as an escape from this kind of burdensome freedom, blaming a racialized, nationalized, gendered, othered subject for the problems of a vociferous colonial capitalism, with the strong-handed fascist leader taking charge and spearheading this apparent escape. And it should also be noted, and not parenthetically, that fascist leaders the world over tend to be elected democratically, usually with the assistance of a shamelessly corporatized media. And so why then should we defend democracy? Is it not so thoroughly sullied that it can only be abandoned by those of us committed to some kind of progressive politics? I want to say no, and that it's worth rejecting these hideous distortions and tyrannies that have operated under the sign of democracy. Achille Mbembe, he's talking about colonialism here, says that colonialism, quote, is the very thing enabling democracy to leave itself behind, to place itself deliberately at the service of something other than that which it proclaimed in theory, and to exercise, when required, dictatorship over itself, its enemies, and those it rejected as different. Close quote. So when democracy is put to work for a system of exploitation and naked oppression, we can think of it as leaving itself behind. Because real democracy kind of lacks a center. It's a space of sort of radical negativity that demands from us repeated negotiation, and yeah, it's sort of formally, it's always unsettled. It's a form that fosters other forms, or maybe a structure that begats other structures that respond to in situ political problems. So it's always kind of changing with the different voices that make up the democratic process. And I think this is why Jacques Rancière speaks about democracy as a hatred of democracy. It's always undermining itself and making itself anew in accordance with the demands of the demos. And so we destroy one democratic form only to make another, which is then once again remade through an always unfinished set of democratic principles. And this kind of democracy is grounded in a collective ethics because it is by definition held accountable to the collective. And it's certainly too much to ask the bourgeois or the capitalist state to embrace a radical democracy of this kind, but it's fundamental to anti-capitalist social movements. And this is where psychology, maybe even psychologists, can come in, where fascism undeniably retains a kind of psychic appeal, the sort of apparent protection of a strong political figure who offers kind of perverse enjoyment and bucking of liberal mores. There's a sort of perverse satisfaction in that. But radical democracy also offers a kind of satisfaction, but its appeal, its psychic appeal, is structured quite differently to this kind of fascistic democracy. It's a democracy based on desire rather than fear or anxiety. And so because radical democracy, as I say, kind of lacks a center, or it doesn't give a definitive political program, it represents what the psychoanalysts call a politics of desire, a kind of lacking space in which we can collectively make and remake the project of emancipation, responding always to what this project demands of us as a multitude. And we sort of continually encircle what emancipation is, what it could be, and how it could be actioned without ever kind of landing definitively on it. And in this way, we kind of prefigure democracy. We practice democracy, the kind of democracy within that we'd like to see without. And this also opens democracy up to the multitude. Every cook can govern, as C.L.R. James would say. But this democratic space is also definitely, it's like a very antagonistic one. And it's a space that definitely doesn't need psychologists, but it is one in which psychologists, if permitted, can work in collaboration with movement activists to assist in pushing these movements forward through a democratically constituted politics of desire. The psychologist can thus form part of a kind of internal effort that looks to ensure that conflict within movements serves radically democratic and political ends, rather than just psychologically satisfying ones. Conflict, in this way, can become democratic rather than politically paralyzing. And I think that this is psychological work, just not as we ordinarily understand it. And so it's my view that just as we need not cede democracy to fascistic leaders and capitalist overlords, we also need not cede our desires to them. We can use these desires to drive a project of liberation that, because it is subject to radically democratic principles, is not only made by us, but it's also held accountable and made responsible to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Again, I think Nick offering us a caution about how it is that we need to think about democracy as a constrained project that always opens up the possibilities for fascism. And at the same time, offering a defense of a different kind of democracy, perhaps one that is slightly more diffuse, something that is slightly less centered in a politics, but much more centered in people and a politics of desire. For those of you who are Lacanian in orientation, of course, you'll know Lacan's work on the politics of desire. So thank you very, very much, Nick. I'm now going to ask Nick Nelson and Darren Hodgetts to perhaps come on at this point. Darren, I'm not sure whether you're going to be speaking first or Nick's going to be speaking first.
I will.
Great. Over to you.
Thank you, Garth, and thank you to colleagues for what's been said already and for the kind invitation today. We're actually speaking on behalf of an international group of scholars who have been working on this problem of human security and increasingly doing so in relation to some of the more recent developments among the United Nations attempts to address global issues such as climate change and so forth. What I've done is, hopefully you can see the slide, I've put up a reference where we've actually provided an overview and review of general psychology about this work, some initial theorizing and some attempts to look at practical ways of applying some of these theoretical ideas to a range of interconnected problems. What I'd like to do is just briefly talk about this conceptualization of human security, what we see human security psychology as being about in terms of bringing different areas of psychology together. And then what we want to do is exemplify some of that in a way that will relate to what the previous opening speakers have talked about, and in particular, efforts to manipulate publics in order to get authoritarian figures and some right-wing extremists into power. And once they are in power, we have real attempts to undermine the security of masses of people, both within nation states and globally. Now, human security as a term is a relatively new term coined by a 1994 UN report with 7 dimensions: economic, health, and so forth. Some previous work we've done as a collective has added 3 dimensions around global, digital, and so on. And the exemplar we'll use today is about digital insecurity through the hacking of an election in the United States. What we've done is put up there as a working definition of human security as an ideal state, something to strive towards, and foundational to this ideal state are forms of liberation, particularly among oppressed peoples globally. This is also reflected in our collective, which is a combination of both Indigenous psychologists and non-Indigenous psychologists working together and trying to broaden our understandings of human psychology and human security accordingly. So we see human security psychology as an attempt to contribute to the securing of the needs for self-determination, peace, inclusion, healthy jobs and healthy communities and harmonious or more harmonious intergroup relationships. And we see this also related to big biological and physical issues around environmental and global sustainability. So human security psychology is also an attempt to connect research, theory and practice or praxis across the various spheres of our discipline today, because increasingly psychology is quite siloed in many respects. And it's an attempt to look at what different specialisms within the discipline can contribute to such an agenda. And in reading and preparing our work in this area, we discovered that psychology has been in the business of securing community relationships, mental health for people, physical health, and so on, really since the inception of our discipline. So we've been starting to write about some of those processes as well. It's also our initial conceptualizations of human security are based on the idea of that the universe we inhabit together is made up of entanglements of material, cultural, dynamic and emerging assemblages. So here we're working on and drawing on notions from assemblage theory, but central to the ways we're conceptualizing here are indigenous notions of what it means to be a person, this notion of interdependent and interconnected selves. That this can be linked across to aspects of continental thought, particularly around panpsychism, but often without the reductionist tendencies that have come with that approach as it's manifest within contemporary physics or biology and so on. This, of course, one way of thinking about that slightly differently would be through the lens of assemblage thinking, but it also raises issues around relational ethics, about different groups engaging the knowledge production process itself, but also applications where we're not really as a collective in the business of producing knowledge for knowledge's sake, even though we have no issue with that, but also about using this to engage in transformative praxis around the different dimensions of human security. So what we're doing here is approaching human beings as in themselves assemblages of biological, material, cultural, biographical elements that in turn are positioned within larger, or as elements within larger constellations of communities, societies, environmental configurations that also are dynamic and emergent and are moving over time as threats emerge, conflicts develop, and are responded to, and really trying to develop the conversation at the moment is about developing a new science for producing knowledge that really can engage with these dynamic processes rather than kind of quite crude cause and effect kind of relationships. So human security psychology is really about documenting how different elements and dimensions of human security function dynamically and in concert. So clearly jobs are linked to housing, they're linked to food and water security, they're linked to health, they're linked to a whole range of other factors, digital divides and so on. And they collectively, as they interact and overlap with one another, shape human existences in often quite inequitable ways and the planet as a whole. So how we behave has implications, how the globe behaves, weather storms and so on can also change our practices and behavior. So we're really wanting to dig into that stuff. And really the exemplar we want to provide today, and I'll hand over to Nick shortly, is to really look at some of the interconnections between political forms of insecurity, the digital, the national, and so on, and increased group conflicts, and really how we're approaching, and one of the key shifts within human security is moving away from a notion of securing territories and the conflicts that come with that, to actually about securing lives, communities, so that people can thrive and so on. And we feel that our discipline has a history of this. We have a history of getting it wrong as well, and of siding maybe with the forces that we shouldn't have been siding with. And there are plenty of examples of that in our history, but really thinking about how human security can be undermined and democracy can be undermined in ways that fester racialized, classed and gendered injustices and so on. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you, Darren, and thank you also to Saisa and to you, Garth and Fatima, for the very kind invitation to speak here. The centrality of information and communicative processes in persuading society has historically made the media one of the key networks of power and influence in society. The rapid expansion of social media platforms has, however, enabled revolutionary changes in how this power is wielded and how persuasion occurs. While initially celebrated as providing a new commons where democracy can flourish, such platforms have more recently given rise to a much darker scenario, one where a variety of actors can generate information, misinformation, and disinformation to persuade others for nefarious purposes. This manipulation of public opinion via social media has a profound impact on how political, economic, and social issues are both understood and addressed. It has also contributed to the rise of authoritarianism across the world and is threatening the very concept of democracy itself. It is also far more widespread than many realise. In 2020, the University of Oxford's Computational Propaganda Research Project identified 81 governments using social media to spread computational propaganda and disinformation about politics to influence elections. And while a comprehensive body of theory, research, and practice on the topic of persuasion has been developed over many years, persuasion in the contemporary social media environment is one that researchers are yet to fully understand. In an effort to identify new insights into the processes of political persuasion in contemporary society, we undertook an analysis drawing on Aristotle's rhetorical framework of the Russian information operation conducted via social media to influence the outcome of the 2016 US presidential elections. This sophisticated, comprehensive, planned, and carefully executed operation commenced in early 2014 with the establishment of an elite and highly secretive department known as the Translator Project within Russia's Internet Research Agency, or the IRA. And this is a troll farm based in St. Petersburg and working on behalf of Russia's security services. The IRA was tasked to, as you can see there, sow division and discord in the US political system, including by creating social and political polarization, undermining faith in democratic institutions, and influencing US elections. And you can see the IRA building there as well. Now, working on the premise that influence campaigns don't create divisions on the ground, they amplify divisions on the ground, the IRA undertook an intensive period of research, both online and on the ground in the US, to understand the key fracture points within US society, and thus the specific audiences that could be targeted for persuasion. At its highest level, the data indicated that the IRA segmented voters into three distinct audiences: right-wing, left-wing, and African-American audiences. Importantly, it did this focusing in traditional swing states. Now, posing as US citizens, the IRA then developed an expansive digital ecology comprising hundreds of social media pages, 73 specifically themed groups, and a large number of personas, which were then used to engage with the targeted audiences. This engagement exploited and amplified existing political cleavages with the overarching goal of mobilizing conservative voters while simultaneously suppressing liberal voters. Although the overwhelming majority of postings during this campaign was organic, our analysis shows that the IRA utilized paid advertising or inorganic messages to micro-target specific audiences through seed postings. These messages could be categorized into three classes of argument. Firstly, racial injustice. Secondly, liberal inequity. And thirdly, white grievance and fear. These were differentially targeted at three distinct ecosystems or audiences: African-American, left-wing, and right-wing voters respectively. Issues based on race played a significant role in the IRA influence campaign, with almost 60% of messages targeting racial injustice. The vast majority of these messages tapped into pre-existing beliefs by utilizing examples of systemic racism, police brutality, poverty, and failure of the current political system in supporting African Americans. These messages were designed to generate anger and frustration, as well as a sense of disillusionment, which was then amplified through organic messaging to discourage voting. Means of persuasion for left-wing voters were remarkably similar to those targeted at African Americans, although of course the arguments were different. These arguments focused on a number of politically and emotionally charged liberal issues, such as LGBTQ, human and gender rights, as well as broader issues of discrimination. As with the African American audience, the IRA generated messaging highlighting an existing political system that was failing the liberal audience and was designed to persuade left-wing voters to either opt out of voting for Clinton or to vote for an alternative left-leaning candidate, such as Jill Stein. Of note, in key swing states, the votes for Stein in the elections were more than the difference between the votes for Trump and Clinton. Messaging to right-wing voters overwhelmingly adopted an ultra-conservative nationalist argument designed to create anger, enmity, and ultimately fear that the nation state, its institutions, and values were under threat. These messages were often factually incorrect or misleading and utilised well-known racist tropes to provide the seeds for eliciting outrage with right-wing voters. They were designed to mobilise right-wing voters to vote for Donald Trump. In delivering these messages, the IRA exploited not only the protection provided under the First Amendment of the US Constitution that guarantees freedom of speech and expression, but also the lack of oversight and regulation of social media companies that allows hateful content to thrive online. They then utilised the technical capabilities of Facebook, in particular its ability to micro-target users, in a way that enhanced the likelihood that messages were accepted and attended to. Micro-targeted delivery of carefully designed inorganic multimedia messages was undertaken to the three segmented audiences. Through links in these inorganic messages, prosumers were then delivered to IRA-created social media sites unique to each audience. This transformed the audience from a passive one to one where they became prosumers, actively engaging in organic discussion with like-minded peers to undertake collective sense-making. This sense-making, however, was carefully and continuously shaped through IRA inorganic messaging to achieve Russia's desired outcomes. A micro-targeted delivery to segmented audiences also enabled the creation of echo chambers where pre-existing beliefs were amplified inside a closed system insulated from contradictory messaging. This provided the IRA with considerable opportunities. By way of example, leading up to the 2016 US presidential elections, a Facebook page was created and controlled by Russians from the IRA. This page, Heart of Texas, was a fake right-wing group with an anti-immigration, anti-Muslim focus, and it attracted more than 254,000 followers. The IRA used this page to generate outrage and create a mass protest at an Islamic center in Houston to stop the perceived Islamization of Texas. At the same time, the IRA created a Facebook page called the United Muslims of America. While this was based on a real group, it was a fake social media page. The IRA used this page to organize a large counter-protest on the opposite street corner at the exact same time. And what neither side knew was that Russian trolls caused both sides to battle in the streets, which in turn caused real social division amongst Americans. And all of this was done by the IRA for less than $200. Overall, this sophisticated social media campaign reached between 110 and 130 million people. Whether this was sufficient to influence the outcome of the 2016 election is unknown. What is known, however, is that the campaign resulted in significantly increased voter turnout and hundreds of thousands of additional conservative votes being cast. Given the outcome of the election was decided by only some 77,000 votes across 3 swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that it did influence the election outcome certainly can't be ruled out. It is also likely that the campaign contributed to the outcome through the suppression of left-wing votes from liberal and African-American voters. So as academics, what can we do to address the threats posed to democracy by these social media platforms? First and foremost, we need to understand what the actual problem is and the full extent of it, and we don't. So we need to undertake research to collect and analyze data on how persuasion is being affected in this environment. This will require much greater transparency from social media platforms, probably enforced, as well as the development of methodologies that better explore the dynamic environment that is social media. What this will do is give us data to better appreciate and understand what these powerful social media companies are doing, how and why they do it, and under what conditions. Only then will we be in a position to engage in evidence-based decision and policy making. Thank you.
is much more all-encompassing. For those of you familiar with community psychology, you'll see synergies between the way that Darren has spoken about human security psychology and community psychology in a kind of nested way. Yeah, the individual located with a particular biological orientation inside families, inside communities, inside cultural spaces, and so on. Nick, I see you back. We lost you for a minute there. Can I hand back to you? You were talking a little bit about how one attends to the question of social media and its impact on democracy, and what are some of the things that we can do. So let me hand back.
Thank you, Garth. So really, I was just saying that as academics, I think we have a responsibility to, first and foremost, understand what the problem is, and we actually don't understand it at the moment. So we need to undertake research to collect and analyze data on how persuasion is being affected in this environment. This will require a much greater transparency from social media platforms, and we'll probably need to enforce this. But it will also require the development of methodologies that better explore the environment that is social media itself. Until we do this, only then will we be in a position to engage in evidence-based decision and policy making. Thanks, Garth.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Nick. I mean, again, just to say that I think what we are talking about here is human security and its interface with technological innovation, digital transformation. We've all seen this occurring very rapidly over the last several years. COVID has in fact amplified that significantly. And certainly both Darren and Nick reflecting on, I suppose, what social psychologists would refer to as processes of persuasion. In this instance, the way that human behaviors are influenced, our social fractures that pre-exist are amplified within the digital context. And then, of course, reflecting on this thing that we now all refer to as the metaverse, the place that we occupy when we are not in this space here speaking to each other, the Twitter space, the Instagram space, the Facebook space. Well, if you're still on Facebook, you're clearly of a particular age, because young people don't do Facebook any longer. So let me just refer to it as the metaverse more collectively. But I think that Darren and Nick are really looking at the relationship between human security psychology and digital transformation, and the way that human behavior can be influenced and shaped in this space, and how democracy itself can be undermined under those circumstances. So thanks again, Darren. Thanks, Nick. I'm now going to ask Hlonipha Mokoena to really share her thoughts. And just to say to you, I've worked with Hlonipha for several years at Wits University. She's always a little left field. I can always expect something different from her. So Hlonipha, over to you. Let's throw the cat amongst the pigeons.
Well, I don't know which one will survive, the cat or the pigeon. So thank you so much, Garth. I hope everyone can hear me. And I am in South Africa. I just love the background because it gives exactly that unreal sense of being in the New York Public Library. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Garth and Fatima, for making this possible. I'm just gonna go straight away, and I'm not gonna read. I'm actually just gonna talk to my point. So when Garth asked me to contribute to this panel, the first question that I asked him was, do I have to accept the premise of the panel's title? I asked the question because I don't actually think that democracy is being annihilated or under threat. And democracy here, obviously, in scare quotes or inverted quotes. This is not because I'm not aware of the various crises that are happening around the globe. Everything from the environment to warfare to colonization. This is not a commentary on any of those crises. Rather, my point of view is that democracy is the wrong word to use for what is being threatened with annihilation. To start with, I want to use South Africa as an example for why I want to argue that democracy is not a very good concept. So since 1948, South Africa has been governed essentially by only two political parties. From 1948 to 1994, the governing party was the National Party. And from 1994 to the present, it has been the African National Congress. Effectively, that means that as a country, we have been living under dictatorship since 1948. This is despite the fact that since 1994, we go and we vote. There are dozens of political parties that contest elections. South Africa's probably got the longest list of political parties in the world. You have everything from, the serious political parties, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and then you have the KISS party, and they all contest elections. We have an independent electoral commission that organizes the election. There has been no evidence that the ruling party rigs elections. And we have a hardworking and progressive constitutional court that defends our constitution. So then what is wrong with this picture? Is South Africa a failed democracy simply because the population keeps voting for the same political party, regardless of the party's lackluster performance? Let me suggest a very simple reason that we have had only two governing parties. And this is when the cats then are going to be amongst the pigeons. Is that Black South Africans and white South Africans are actually the same. They share the same values. And what are those values? It's an aversion to extremism. So the reason why white South Africans voted for the National Party time and time again under apartheid is not because it was a fake democracy. It's because the other extremes were worse. So it was like, stick to the devil that you know. Black South Africans have accepted exactly the same value. There are very many parties in South Africa, but they all represent extremes, which Black South Africans don't want. So what do? You stick to the devil that you know. You vote for the same political party because you are just trying to keep out the extremists. So in fact, South African values, both Black South African values and white South African values, are based on this basic conservative idea. It is much better to have the person who is incompetent than to have the person who's an extremist. So if you ask many Black South Africans why they don't vote, let's say for the EFF, for example, they'll tell you, just before the last elections in South Africa, someone posted on Twitter and said, voting for the EFF is like putting a loaded gun in a child's hand. And that literally summed up the way that Black people think about extremist political parties. It's like taking a loaded gun and putting it in the hands of a child. And so that is the most controversial thing I'm going to say about South Africa, which is that Black South Africans and white South Africans are essentially the same in terms of their core values. Keep out the extremists, vote for even the incompetent person. So this is why we've only had one political party. But then does this mean that we are less of a democracy? Is South Africa less of a democracy because the majority of the country's population don't care about political parties? And this is where I want to draw the first distinction in what I understand the failure of the concept of democracy. Is that essentially to many people, democracy is nothing but a fight between political parties. It is not about questions of fairness and justice and who gets what and is the society distributing wealth and all. None of those concepts actually come under the concept of democracy for most people. What most people see when they turn on the television and when they listen to the news is just fights between political parties. So in South Africa, our parliament often ends up being a real bun fight where the politicians are at each other, they have to be dragged out by security and all of that. When South Africans see that, they say, well, that's democracy. It's just people fighting in parliament over meaningless concepts. So that's one part. And then the second part, and this is the part where as academics we come in, is that the very notion of governance is itself contested. So let me give you an example. Every year, our Minister of Finance stands in Parliament and distributes billions of rands. So in South Africa, our government spends 80% of the revenue it receives on social services. But if you had to ask your average South African, what did the Minister of Finance actually say? They have no idea. And you know why? It's because of the language that is used. The Minister of Finance will stand there and say, in the current financial year, we will be raising the repo rate by 0.75%. Do you think that the majority of South Africans know what the repo rate is? Do you think they even know what 0.75% means? They don't know. And so they are sitting there at home being bombarded essentially by jargon that comes out of the state, and they are expected somehow to then respond to that with a love for democracy. And that does not make any sense, precisely because our politicians speak the most unbelievable jargon. So I'm going to again just make that as a point, that part of the reason why democracy is incomprehensible to most people who live in South Africa is exactly because it is shrouded in this language of jargon which politicians use when they stand and speak in parliament. And as I say, the Minister of Finance is a perfect example. Despite the fact that he's giving away billions and billions and billions of rands, nobody understands where those billions are going, because nobody understands what the repo rate is, or what the current financial year is, or what the treasury is, because he uses words like that, like the treasury will distribute. People are like, what is the treasury? We don't know what that is. They've never seen, they don't know what that concept refers to. So part of the reason then that democracy is inexplicable to most people is exactly that it's already shrouded by so much jargon. So that's the first point. And also that point about political parties. The second point, and this is a historical one, is that democracy was not even our first option. So we are now talking about democracy as if it was always the obvious choice that as human beings we were going to make. Up until the end of the Second World War, democracy was not number one. The reason why democracy became number one is because America had to rescue Europe from fascism. I mean, that's a way of thinking about how the end of the Second World War involved the United States. The United States flew into Europe, rescued Europeans from Mussolini and Hitler, and that's how democracy became an international concept. But it was not our first choice. And if you read Plato's Republic, it wasn't even the philosopher's first choice. So philosophy, in this case, exactly the foundation of most of our disciplines, didn't even put democracy as a first choice. Plato did not like democracy. So then if you gave someone walking in the streets of South Africa Plato's Republic, and you ask them what they learned from it, they'll tell you that they learned that democracy is a bad idea. But we keep telling people that it's a good idea. Why do we keep saying that? It's exactly because we as intellectuals are wedded to the idea of democracy, which actually is the opposite of democracy's actual past as a theoretical and philosophical concept. So that's the second point. Sorry, I'm going to rush through these points because I don't want to run out of time. The third point I want to make is that, as it happens always in human history, the crisis that we prepare for is not the crisis that we get. So in the 20th century, we prepared for the crisis of nuclear warfare. That is not the crisis that we have gotten. We have gotten a totally different crisis. And now we are trying to repurpose the tools that we used to prepare for the last crisis, to prepare for this, or to mitigate this current crisis. The fourth point I want to make is a point about something that I call altruism. And again, this is to capture all the concepts that the other speakers have presented. That one of the reasons why we often then end up running out of ideas as intellectuals is because we run away from concepts that are actually very useful in understanding human beings. So for example, people mentioned the COVID pandemic. The one lesson that I learned as a human being from the COVID crisis is that human beings are not altruistic at all. That in fact, we are a deeply selfish species. So I'll just give you an example. So when the vaccines were first being proposed, there was no one in the world who said, listen, I don't want to get the vaccine. Give the vaccine to the most vulnerable people in the world. I can wait. I'm sure I can continue to wash my hands and wear a mask. There was hardly anyone who volunteered, because this is where the difference between true altruism and forced altruism is. Most of us are living in situations where we are being forced to be altruistic by state policies, by our governments, but we do not volunteer to be altruistic. There isn't a single population in the world that said, I'm volunteering not to be vaccinated first. Instead, everyone was like, no, I want the vaccine first. I nearly used an expletive. Forget about the poor, forget about the sick, forget about the elderly. They can take care of themselves. So that's the other point. And then I want to talk a little bit about the question of justice. And then maybe I'll conclude. And one of the problems is, again, the way that we talk about justice as academics. We tell poor people that all that they should want are decent jobs, decent housing, decent education. And we keep using words like decent to talk about things that we ourselves actually have very little experience of. And I can tell you that living in South Africa, there is no such thing as a decent job and a decent house and decent education. And the reason for that is that South Africa is actually one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Someone who lives in the township of Soweto is 40 kilometers away from Sandton. When you go to Sandton and you walk around the shops there, you can buy a watch that is worth 2.5 million rands, buy a car that is worth 3 million rands, just 30 kilometers away. Now, to tell that person that all they want or all that they should want is a decent job and a decent house is actually a lie, precisely because in the window in Sandton, they can see exactly what they are being denied. It's not that they are being denied a decent house and a decent job and decent education. It's that they are being denied an Audemars Piguet, which costs 2.5 million rands. Now, luxury goods, by their very definition, cannot be democratized. That's why they are luxury goods. Many of South Africa's young people don't want anything decent. They want those luxury goods. They want to see themselves in a Brave Boost, in a Mercedes-Benz Brave Boost, wearing an Audemars Piguet. Now, there's no way of having that conversation if you keep talking about inequality as just being a question of decency. Decent this, decent job, decent that, decent that. That is not what people think about when they think about a fair and just world. They think, how can I get my hands on an Audemars Piguet? And I have conversations with young people in South Africa. I talk at schools. Many of South Africa's young people just want luxury goods. They don't want anything decent. They already have that because the government provides them with that. They don't want that. They want the luxury items. And as academics, we are terrible at talking about luxury items. And to conclude, one of the points that I think, again, we need to talk about is the question of anti-culture. So what you see a lot in the Trumpisms and the rise of the right wing is anti-culture. So this is also the reason why I'm sitting in the library and I have a library as my background. My mom was a librarian. I grew up reading books. And I can tell you from growing up, most people hate reading. So when people like Trump say they don't want to read a critical race theory, it's not because they hate critical race theory, it's because they hate reading. And most people in the world don't want to sit with a book, which is why it is that so many people then are relying on social media as their main source of news. They don't want to sit down with a book and be challenged. And if you ask them why they don't like reading, they say, it gives me a headache. This is what you get in South Africa. People will say, well, it gives me a headache. So people want the easy access, easy to digest little nuggets of stories. The idea that they should sit down with a 500-page book and read it from cover to cover reminds them that they are still in school. So this is the basic assumption. So this anti-culture has very little to do with democracy. Again, it has everything to do with the assumptions that we make as intellectuals, that because we enjoy sitting down with a 500-page book and reading it from cover to cover, everyone else in the world has the same pleasure. And not everyone in the world enjoys reading. And so we have to defend democracy on a different foundation other than the foundation that democracy is about reading books, that it is about rationality, that it is about exercising your good naturedness or your good neighborliness. None of those values are values that we actually share with other human beings. And we have to be very careful about the assumptions that we make about which values society should be based on. I think I'm gonna end there, and then we can continue with the rest of the conversation in the discussion.
amongst the pigeons. Hlonipa, thanks very much again. I mean, I always knew you were going to bring your own disciplinary experience as a historian and as a historian of intellectual lineages, and you've certainly done all of that, also including aspects of philosophy and the ways that we think about our assumptions and our values. I'm not going to go through everybody's presentation in summary, but suffice to say, we've got about, Fatima, about 10 minutes, and we'll take a round of questions and answers perhaps. But suffice to say that I think that what you've seen is a very, very diverse set of views on the question of democracy and where we are in our democracy and how it is that psychology can be thought about in relation to democracy. Now, Adira's raised a kind of fundamental question about whether in places of dispossession, marginality, where flesh, body, and psyche are all implicated in processes of marginalization, whether democracy itself can exist in the first place. Nick's raised the question, Nick Malherbe has raised the question about democracy's perhaps tendency towards fascism, and that if one is not careful, this becomes a potential endpoint for the kind of democracies that we saw in the 20th century. And that instead of thinking about democracy as centralized inside a political apparatus, we need to think about democracy as located much more diffusely in individuals, in people, in communities, in relationships, and that it is built on a politics of desire. Darren and Nick Nelson have really raised the idea of a human security psychology, a newer construct in our lexicon, in our vocabulary in psychology today, and trying to think about how all-encompassing and interconnected the question of human security really is. But in particular, looking at the way that this impacts on, or this is impacted upon by digital transformation, the tech revolution, and as I've already indicated, the influence on human behaviors, the amplification of social fractures and cleavages, and of course, this idea of the metaverse. And then, of course, Hlonipa has, I think, has fundamentally questioned whether we are using the right analytic tool to answer the kind of question about democracy's stability, annihilation, promise, etc. She raises questions about South Africa, reflecting on how it is that perhaps all of us, black, white, pink, blue, really reflect a kind of conservatism in our value systems that actually knit us together in ways that we perhaps have not always thought about. And that actually, this doesn't mean that democracy is not alive and well. Democracy may very well be alive and well, but the question is whether it's comprehensible and explicable to the majority of people in our country. And this in and of itself does not mean that democracy is at stake. The last one or two points that Hlonipa's made, I suppose, is also is about what I think she would refer to as the genre of thinking about the evils of the world. That if the genre that we think through is always an altruistic genre, that we may be mistaken in our understanding of the world because perhaps we're not all as altruistic as we think we are. And of course, this is a kind of fundamental challenge to those of us in psychology, where the kind of conditions of empathy and congruence and altruism are central not only to the way that we trained, but are central to the kind of intellectual frameworks that we've utilized over the last 100 years or so. Questions of the anti-culture and coming to terms with what the internal workings of a democracy really look like. A kind of honest reflection on what the internal workings of a democracy really look like before one can start to think about how it is that we attend to some of its problems. So I'm going to leave my synopsis there and perhaps throw open to all of you questions for our panel. We're probably only going to have time for one decent round of questions. So over to all of you. Yes, we have a question from Professor Cooper. Can we just use the microphone, please?
So basically, then, there's no role for psychology. If this is the scenario, there's no role for a psychology which tends to see the symptoms and is totally disabled. I'm using my words very carefully there. Disabled from dealing with the etiology of what's presented to us. And in a society like ours, with so many shifting sands, is it worth doing that which we end up and are trained to do? And particularly, and I'm very well aware that this is Mental Health Month, and on Monday was Mental Health Day. There's a high incidence of suicide. The World Health Organization has reported that 6 out of the 10 top countries with suicide are in Africa. And we have the highest disaffection rate of anybody in the world. Highest unemployment, lowest employment, highest violence without being at war, etc., etc., etc. So what role then for psychology in this annihilated and discursive democracy where we've been fed a particular narrow system of party political dominance and not for the person that we are supposed to be holding accountable as our representative?
Sats, thank you. I'm not sure whether that's a question or whether that's a comment, actually. I suspect it's part question, part comment, and it's part rhetorical and partly directed to all of us to consider. But are you wanting the panel to? No? Okay, thanks. Thank you. I see we have a question at the back.
Thanks, God.
Sorry, is that Jace? I can't see
Yes,
this far
correct.
any longer, Jace.
Lucky I can still see you. My glasses. Thank God. A special thanks to all the speakers. I think they raised very, very critical issues with regard to the topics that they focused on. In fact, I made some notes on some of those issues, but there's definitely no time to go into them. But what I would like to focus on is they spoke about the implications in terms of academics. So I think we sitting here, and majority of us are psychologists, I assume, would like to know what are the implications of what they said for psychologists who are working in communities, working in practices, working in public institutions. What will be the role and the implications based on what they've said? I mean, Nick's idea of democracy and the psychic in terms of the role that psychologists can play and the appeal that he spoke about. What are the implications of this? I can go on with all the speakers in terms of the racism and the digital platforms and so on. But maybe if each of the speakers could clearly indicate just 1 or 2 concrete things in terms of the implication for the role of psychologists.
Thanks, Jace. Let me just hold that. To those of you online, I suppose the question that Jace has really posed to the entire panel is, can you give us some indication of what this would mean in very real terms for the way that we deal with the kind of challenges that we see today? And for those of you who are psychologists or trained in psychology, perhaps to think about that in relation to psychologists. For those of you who are not, perhaps to think about this more broadly as citizens, human beings, and so on. But if you can just hold that for 1 minute, I want to see if there are other questions at this point. We've got one more here.
My question goes directly to Prof. Nadera. You quoted the Minister for Religion in Israel talk to students and pointed out that the biblical and security sides of the narratives, in your opinion, from your studies, what should be the helpful role of religion from both sides of the divide in the annihilation of democracy, given that religion and God is used by both sides to justify their positions?
Thank you. Was that directed at Nadira? I think we may have lost her online, actually. Is she still online? I think we may have lost her online. We'll see if she comes back, and I'll certainly pose that question. I'm going to take one more, and then I'm going to turn back to the panel. Daniel? To one.
I'm just phrasing this question as clinicians, as experts. One of the things that we're noticing is we would prefer sometimes to just have an apathetic viewpoint of politics, that the politicians do what they do, and we'll just carry on doing what we do. The problem is that those spaces become completely encroached. Two examples of that would be things like, for example, what's busy going on with NHI. The Ombudsman reports that came out with the Life is Remeni saying that it was politicians not listening to experts. And we're finding that as experts or clinicians, we cannot be quiet because human lives are at stake. We know that politics has got a lot to do with the idea of charisma. You know, the one who sounds the smartest often is the one who gets heard. It's public opinion. That's how you win. Whereas with expertise, and specifically with scientific, it's not like that. In fact, great minds don't think alike. That's the whole point. And I'm just wondering to know, because I think that eventually will become where it's at. Case in point, silly example, but if you find yourself in an accident and you've got a choice between a ComServe medical doctor or the Minister of Health, who would you prefer to have at the accident with you? And yet the decision-making of those two individuals are very different.
Daniel, can I just check, is there a particular question that you're wanting to pose there?
So the question is, we cannot ignore these spaces anymore, but as the experts, where do we then frame ourselves within this? Because eventually the human rights falls on us.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask the panel to think about this in relation to the question that Jace was asking as well. And then I think we've got a question. I think I saw a hand here. Can we just have a mic?
I think my question is just focusing on psychology in terms of his positionality. One says that psychology remains disconnected from the constitution of the country. South Africa has a very strong constitution.
Can you just speak into the mic?
Yeah, what I'm basically saying, psychology continues to be disconnected from the constitution of the country. South Africa has a very strong constitution. My point is to say, to the extent that we are psychologists, what is our role? It seems to me that psychology remains a backing dog outside the fence. We talk about psychology is potential to be an activist profession, but we are not getting there yet.
Thanks, Thabang. I'm going to ask our panelists online to perhaps respond to the question about what does all of this mean in real terms? If one is not to abstract these questions too much, what does it mean for citizens, for human beings, for practitioners, for clinicians, for psychologists? What does it mean to tackle some of the questions that you've raised today? I'm going to do a kind of reversal here. Hlonipa, I'm going to start with you, partly because your image is still showing. So give it a crack.
Okay, so let me just give you throw something in there. So there is a very, very popular psychologist in South Africa, and his name is Jordan Peterson, and he's not even South African, he's Canadian. I was introduced to Jordan Peterson by my cousins. So my cousins hate reading, but they've read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life. Now they post Jordan Peterson quotes on their WhatsApp statuses with candles and Buddhist beads emojis. So it's not that as psychologists you become irrelevant. It's that you are being outpaced by people like Jordan Peterson, who've obviously realized that most people in the world are not looking for a complicated theory of self. Because this is what, as psychologists, you keep wanting to offer people, these complicated theories of self. All that people want is they want to crack the code. You know, like you have the movie, The Matrix. They want to crack the code. They want to know, is this the reality that I'm stuck with? Or is there another reality that I should be accessing? So this is the question that many of my cousins, and my cousins are mostly Black males, that's all they want to know. How do I access that other reality that other people seem to be engaging in? You know, what makes it possible for someone to end up a billionaire and me here in South Africa stuck and I can't even get a job? That's what they want to know. And that's why they're reading Jordan Peterson. It's because Jordan Peterson is claiming to be helping them crack the code. And so it's not that psychology is irrelevant. And I think many of you just need to start to ask yourself those basic questions. Why are titles like, you know, The Art of Not Giving a Fuck, 12 Rules of Life, the most popular titles in South Africa, the country that you are in? Those are if you go to exclusive books, you'll see that they are in the top 10 best-selling books and exclusive books. Why is that? It's because young people just want to crack the code. And this is one of the reasons why so many young South Africans are suffering from depression. So just yesterday, I was speaking to an Uber driver who was telling me that the child that he has raised his own sister, is always depressed. And the only time she becomes happy is when he gives her money and he takes her out to dinner. And she's always demanding all these things. Take me out to dinner, buy me new shoes. So many young South Africans are basically connecting their sense of self and their happiness to material goods. And I think as psychologists, those are the issues that you need to start to speak to, because otherwise you are going to be outpaced by Jordan Peterson. He will sell more books, he will have more followers. And people from the United States are always horrified when I tell them this, that Black South Africans love Jordan Peterson. He says, put your house in order before you go and point at someone else's disorder. Those are the things that you hear from Black South Africans. Like I say, I didn't know anything about Jordan Peterson until my cousins plugged me into it. They were like, you must read this book. You must read this book. And it's Jordan Peterson. So that's the one piece of advice that I can say to you is that is the market that you are competing with. You are not competing with Russian agents. You're competing with Jordan Peterson to be heard as a professional.
Thanks, Hlonipa. So I think that's a good segue to Nick and to Darren. Maybe for you to just offer some thoughts from your perspective, how it is that you can think about a kind of this emergent field of human security, psychology, and its relation to technology. I mean, what would be the kinds of things that you would be saying psychologists need to be engaged with?
Did you want to go first, Nick? Or?
Yeah, sure, Darren. Just very quickly, and this is a huge question, but I guess I'll just answer very quickly and very pragmatically. I think the role for psychology, both the questions I think are related. The role for psychology is really in helping to create that understanding. And in the digital environment, I don't think we do understand this. This is a very new environment. And much of the research that I'm seeing at the moment, we are overlaying established psychological theories, predominantly the scientific approach, onto those, and it's just not working. So we need to create understanding through the development of better tools and techniques for researching these projects. In line with that, I think, and I agree wholeheartedly with the comment that populism seems to be trumping expertise at the moment as well. So I think the research that we do undertake, we need to make it relevant, we need to make it useful, and we need to be able to communicate it much better than we do, because I think we don't do a good job of that at all. Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. We had a very different experience of COVID, particularly early on. You know, priority was given to the elderly and the ill, Māori and Pacific populations. A lot of money went into targeting specialist programs with those communities, resourcing those communities to get immunisation rates up. But that was a real threat to the right here. So support for that in polls and so on in the first year were in the high 80s. But what happened is money and right-wing political groups went after that. So we've written about this as the security accord, this balance that was occurring at the time between populations being surveyed, public health-wise and work-wise and lockdowns, and freedom, and where people found that balance and the dynamics of that. And what's happened since then in the last year or so is there's been a lot of, particularly news organizations here, but also online lies, basically, and rewriting that history and encouraging selfishness and really trying to cultivate that and to undermine what we achieved as a collective effort. And if we hadn't have done what we did with the effective leadership we had, thousands more of our vulnerable populations would have died. And I think that's now being rewritten as something quite different. And I think this is because we I guess we had the benefit of being a nation of 5.5 million people. We're smaller, we're in an island in the middle of a huge ocean. So there were things we could do in terms of securing borders and so on that weren't possible for other nation states. So we ended up, you know, and we had former MPs or prime ministers from the right calling us a hermit kingdom, and that we were hiding from the world and that we should just open up the gates and let COVID in because we're all going to have to live with it. And I think that became a real tension, and we really saw conflict around. So what we were doing at the time as psychologists is we were actually working quite closely with the government about what was going on. So for example, a lot of the people, QAnon followers and so on, occupied parliamentary grounds. Now, in many nation states, the police would have just gone in with batons and removed them, but that didn't happen here. And there was a real concerted effort. And our conversations with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet at the time were very much about, if you don't want an active insurgency and you don't want this thing and this disruption to grow, then you have to think about why is it that the poor and the dispossessed, many of them who are refusing vaccination, are there in Wellington holding trials to hang the Prime Minister and all this sort of stuff going on. What is it that participation in that offers them that we're not offering them as a nation state? Why is it that their sense of community is in opposition to the mainstream society and so on? So I think as psychologists, part of our role is to understand that phenomena, to understand these tensions and to understand the political manipulation that comes with acts of solidarity, because we had a lot of solidarity. I mean, early on, there were very few people that would object to the elderly and the sick being first in the vaccine queues. So many of us had to wait 6 months. And we were okay with that. But as the pandemic moved on, and as the right got organised in its opposition to a communitarian approach, it shifted quite significantly, and it became quite marginal to the point that I think we'll have a change of government next year because of what they did, even though public health-wise it was incredibly effective. So I think that what's happened over the last few years has created environments that we can really learn from, and that we need to get better research-wise at following these things live and seeing how they change and seeing the dynamism of how do we go from 89% of people supporting a communitarian approach, which meant we lost a lot of freedoms to save our elderly and sick, to a situation where half the population a year and a half, 2 years later actually opposed those stances. Now, you could say it was fatigue, you could say it was other phenomena, but I would argue that the active politicizing around that from opposition parties can tell us what happens in terms of these persuasive processes and how they can undermine, efforts towards solidarity and effective public health strategies. In terms of the other questions, I mean, those are huge, and we can't really comment on the South African situation because that's not, ours is a very, very different context.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to leave the last word to Nick on stage here. Nick, do you just want to share some thoughts?
I'll be quick and respond to some of the questions that were asked. Maybe I should start also by saying that I don't think the role of psychologists is a prerequisite here. The kind of sort of radical open-ended democracy that I was talking about goes on all the time without psychologists, and psychologists often just make it worse, psychologizing the political issues. But if there is a role for psychologists here, it's because this work is, building democracy from the ground up, or sort of solidarity making between kind of seemingly disparate struggles, is intensely agonistic work, and there's a lot of tension, there is a lot of affect. As I say, it goes on anyway, but if there is a role for psychologists, it's psychologists who are invited into these spaces as kind of comrade practitioners rather than practitioners themselves, and to work with this affect politically. How can these antagonisms, tensions be used towards the kind of overall political goal of building this sort of open-ended democracy as well as solidarity? The last thing I wanted to touch on, someone was talking about the role of kind of differing levels of expertise in the process of democracy. And this is a sort of theoretical question that I think gets raised a lot, is it open? If it's open to everyone, is everyone's voice equal? What about dealing in matters of expertise? But we sort of don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel here. When democracy is made or radical democracy is made a kind of abstraction, it is difficult to grapple with these issues, but they are happening sort of materially on the ground. Institutionally, you can look at the industrial workers of the world, or Zapatistas, or Rojava there in Syria. These are sort of generally anarchistic communities. There's experts in these communities, and all decision-making is democratic. It's kind of grappled with within these spaces. The experts are held accountable to the needs of the demos and replaced periodically. There's not one way to do it, but there are ways that it is being done. Experiments in democracy are happening kind of all over the world, usually with a sort of anarchistic undercurrent. So in thinking about these problems, we can also learn from examples that are happening at the moment as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Colleagues online, I think I'm getting a signal here that I need to wrap things up. So Nick, let me just say thank you to you. Darren, thank you to you. Hlonipha, thank you to you. Nadira's left us, but I can understand that. It's probably after 1 in the morning in California. To you, Nick and Darren, have a good evening. Hlonipha, have a great day. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to engaging with you at some point in the future again. To Nick Malherbe, thank you very much. And to all of you, really thank you very much for just being engaged with this particular session. Can we give our panelists a round of applause, please? Thanks, everybody. That concludes this session.
Thank you.
We are going to tea at this point, and we should be back at 1:45 for the keynote address. So can you please be back promptly at 1:45? Thank you, everybody.